talk of today features two speakers from Procore, a construction SaaS company. Jed Nito is a tech lead and manager for site reliability at Procore. He is helping establish SRE best practices across Procore's R&D organization. His co-speaker, Jonathan Solorzano-Hamilton, is the senior manager for SRE at Procore, with over 20 years of field experience leading the effort to scale SRE practices across the engineering org. Jed actually turned to tech from biological science, and Jonathan turned to tech from physics. I think they came together over a shared sense of curiosity, humor, and love for SRE. Now imagine you're leading an engineering org of 100 people. You've just been told that in 5 years, the size of your engineering org will triple to 300. How will you manage the flood of reliability issues that comes with growth? Human cloning is off the table. Or is it? Without further ado, how Procore scales SRE, please help me welcome Jed and Jonathan.
All right, everybody. So we have heard from a trillion-dollar company about how they do SRE, and so I want you all to buckle up and get ready to drop several orders of magnitude, because we are going to talk about how we are figuring it out from the ground up at a much smaller level, and we're going to have to begin with some fundamentals.
So this makes a lot of sense if you think back to a time about 1.2 billion years ago, billion with a B, when small single-celled algae were wandering the Earth and trying to survive the way that we all are as SREs. In the end, environmental stressors changed, and these little organisms decided that they needed to try to do something differently if they were going to survive. So instead of working harder, they actually began to subspecialize. As they subspecialized, they realized that they could do a smaller portion of the work and solve a smaller portion of a problem, and then collectively solve larger problems.
So in the early days, Procore was a lot like that single-celled organism. We were just a couple of SREs with a few, and then a couple of dozen engineers. SRE worked on features, engineers built infrastructure. There was a high degree of environmental stressors in SRE, just like there were for the single-celled algae, but overall it was manageable. And part of that was that in that scale, it's pretty easy to know the full context. Everyone that is out there, all the changes they're making, and everything that's happening. But as we grew, it got harder and harder to keep up with the dev changes. First, SRE stopped being able to have time to contribute to feature work, really just focused on the infrastructure. Then we stopped being able to focus on kind of systemic coding solutions to infra problems, really just had to spend more and more time on toil as more and more unique problems came up. And before we knew it, we really just found ourselves 100% firefighting. Pager going off every couple of days and every couple of hours, and just moving from one fire to the next all the time.
So probably many people who have worked in ops or an SRE know that feeling of being completely overwhelmed and completely just like behind the eight ball at all times is not something that happens suddenly, right? So you're probably familiar with this old fable about boiling a frog, that if you want to boil a frog, you don't put the pot on the stove and boil the water and then put the frog in, because the frog will just realize the water is hot and jump out. But what you do is you put the frog into the water, and then you put the pot on the stove, and then you have a cooked frog. So what we realized was that we were in hot water, and we were actually sort of in the process of boiling because it happened over time. There was a couple of different ways we could approach solving this problem, right? One is like continue to do what we'd done before, which was just hire more SRE, right? Like that's the easy fix. If 3 devs and 1 SRE works, then maybe just making sure that ratio stays the same will like continually help us. But every time we found like one good SRE candidate, it seemed like Procore would hire 10 or 20 new developers, right? So the scale of it doesn't actually work out because it's hard to find SRE that can actually do this work at the same rate that you can find Rails devs in our case, right?
Plus, every time we invited a new frog to come up to the table, they'd take one look at the pot and hop away. Why don't you guys want to come in? The water's fine.
That's a very good point, Jonathan. So what we figured that what we would have to do is try to figure out another way to get SRE. So it led us to this question, like, Jonathan, where did SRE really come from?
Well, Jed, when a dev and an ops love each other very much. So my wife and I actually tried this. Turns out it yields maybe long-term results. The jury's still out. If you think being on call is stressful, try being on call with a pager and a baby asleep next to you. So I call on-call week couch week. So we thought, we need fully formed SRE that have all of the context and all of the organizational knowledge. Turns out the science on this is still in its infancy, and there are a lot of potential complications. So we scrapped that and went back to square one, just hire more people. But if we couldn't hire more SRE,
what we decided to do instead, was hire ops people, hire dev people, right? Because those kind of were more common and easy to find. And then say, well, look, if you're a dev, then we're just going to teach you our infrastructure, and we'll ramp you up on the infrastructure piece. If you're interested in that, we can do that. Or if you're an ops, we can get you kind of familiar with our development practices and then kind of get things done that way. But it turned out that, like, our onboarding times took forever, right? Like, getting a dev who's used to working in a dev, like CI, like a continuous delivery sort of agile framework, to start working on infrastructure was actually really difficult. And additionally, it seemed like there was this problem where hiring more people to like do this work wasn't actually solving the problem we had. So, you know, you can see here, like, adding another person to help change this tire is not actually going to do anything at all, right? So what we realized is, if we wanted to increase the velocity that we were working, we needed to do something other than just simply add more people. So let's go back to this kind of biological idea, right? Part of what happens here is that organisms evolve by responding to stressors and then adapting and making changes and doing things differently. So we figured maybe if we did things differently, we'd actually end up with a better result. So instead of taking one SRE and trying to make more SREs and just try to make more that way, we decided we would subspecialize what we were doing and embed SREs within the squads that were doing feature delivery. And we would integrate in a way that basically made us sort of multicellular, as it were.
We decided that what we needed was a new model. And I owe a hat tip to Gustavo Franco. I went to his talk at SRECon 2019 about how to scale SRE in your organization. And that really resonated with us. We had kind of gotten along by just growing a sort of monolithic, it does everything, kitchen sink, SRE, ops, whatever. If it's got, you know, server APIs in it, then we'll do it. And that was broken. So we decided to specialize embedded SRE squads with our particular development product lines. We also knew we needed a more specialized operations group that was going to be focused just on traditional kind of networking and OS down stuff and delivering commodity infrastructure, because it was going to take time for us to ramp up the SRE with the dev squads to be able to onboard their services. The specific problems that we were trying to solve in our case, we knew where we wanted to get. You know, we wanted more rapid releases. We'd seen the pace of both infrastructure and ultimately application feature delivery start to taper off and then plummet fairly precipitously. We had forklifted a private cloud / bare metal app into the public cloud and had no cloud native infrastructure. We had no error budgets, but even beyond that, we had basically no telemetry. I mean, we had some basic monitoring at Datadog. Is the service up or down? You know, does our site respond to 200 OK to a basic HTTP request? But we needed even more fundamentally just like measuring, can we do the things that our software says it can do? On the personnel level, we wanted to fix turnover. For some reason, people coming into SRE and being paged a few times a day was causing about a 6-month burnout rate. And we also wanted to get out of just survival mode, and not just fix the turnover problem, but in fact make it a center for career growth, like a place where people could say, yeah, this is really cool. I want to do what you're doing and, you know, learn more about it and grow my career in this way. And under all of it, what we wanted to do was establish the concept of Procore, at Procore, of a limited warranty. Basically getting folks used to the idea that they just couldn't throw things over a wall anymore and have somebody for sure catch it. We wanted to make sure that there were defined responsibilities and a well-understood surface area that we handled so that we could be good at it instead of being like kind of miserable and mediocre at everything.
Right. One other thing I'll say on that point is that, you know, if you've been in any organization, any number of organizations I've been in have always been sort of like you wait and you're paused and you're stalled. And the reason why you are is because you're waiting for this one great solution, right? Like you're thinking, if only we could do this one thing. And in the at the time you spend trying to find like one better solution, you end up basically doing the same thing over and over and over again. And so one of the things that we were sort of trying to pursue was, if this isn't working, let's not find the perfect best solution. Let's try something slightly different, or maybe markedly different in our case, but let's just try it, right? Because trying it and moving a little bit ahead gave us some good results, right? So what we ended up doing was exactly what Jonathan said, was we picked a couple of squads and we targeted them as sort of like high value for the organization. It wasn't something that we said, oh, this will be an easy win necessarily, but we were looking for that sort of perfect balance of, this is going to be a good win. This is also going to be high visibility within the organization. So if it succeeds, we'll have a good case to make for doing this further, right? Because one of the things that we realized was, you can come up with a lot of great solutions, but if it's not impacting the business positively, the customer, as was mentioned before, doesn't care whether you're in autoscaling or Kubernetes not. Like that, they're not thinking about that. Like that's cool for us, but the end user doesn't actually care about that, right? They should, maybe, but that's a separate conversation, right? So what we did was we embedded SREs, and we spent a lot of time sort of iterating and having conversations with the devs and attending their stand-ups and sort of really melding the squads into one big squad. And what we learned was that we had a lot of actually shared objectives that we were previously never really communicating about. So
yeah, if I can jump in with some specifics. So not to get too far into the weeds here, but we had a particular service around how we handle like very large PDF uploads, which turns out feature prominently in construction. Blueprints for skyscrapers are pretty difficult to process. And the squad that had spun up the original infrastructure and then also built the code and whatnot, had gotten into a point where it was good, and then it kind of gradually started to get pretty miserable. So things were so bad. I think the infrastructure was down like around a quarter to a third of the time. So we just had multiple fully provisioned infrastructure stacks that would just deliver the service at all times. So we could just cut over by hand between them whenever one of them went down for one reason or another. It was a pretty miserable experience, to the extent that our CEO was getting calls from like Fortune 25 customers that were like, hey, let's, why is it so bad for you to handle this basic feature?
Yeah, and a little bit more on that, not to go really off the rails here, but I've been in some of those incidents. I've been at Procore for approximately 2 years, and when I joined, I was in incidents in this infrastructure where there were devs cutting over to the new infrastructure with our help, and then manually making changes in Redis so that way we could cut back. So literally, there were like 3 copies of this infrastructure. 2 of them were like turning money into heat most of the time, and then we would like cut over to one of the other ones. We'd pick a candidate, and then literally some dev or some group of devs would go in and modify Redis queues by hand and like run a script and then cut everything back. And so it was kind of insane to do it that way, obviously. And again, all of that under the hood, the hair on fire part is fine, but if your customers are like noticing the impact of doing these things, then that's a time to actually like do something different.
And that's not an infrastructure anybody sets out to build.
Correct.
That's the frog in the boiling water. Like you end up at a state where you can look at it and say, this is miserable, and there are many attributes about this that are bad, but it was at the end of a chain of like decisions that were optimized in a local state for a very miserable problem.
Absolutely. So my squad embedded with this exact squad that we're talking about, where they were doing a lot of manual work. And we've been there for about 6 months. And very recently, the CEO of our company approached the dev manager from that organization and said, sort of, I'm not getting complaints from customers anymore. Like, what did you change? What did you do? What's different? And I think it's summed up here. This is what he told us he said, so it's probably pretty close to accurate, which is, there's no genius with a silver bullet idea here. This isn't something that is like some new technology that we put in place. It's really just that we have two teams coming together with shared objectives, and that we're doing what we should have been doing all along, which is basically paying attention to what direction we're pulling in. The other thing that I think really came out of this, and I think that this was touched on, or at least sort of alluded to previously, was it's not about a genius coming in or some rock star coming in and solving a problem. We didn't use new technology. We didn't use some advanced techniques other than human communication, which is actually often, in my humble opinion, where a lot of things break down. So having this cadence of communication between the squads really, really benefited us.
In order to get to that point, we first had to get started. And the building blocks of how we decided to set out on this journey, first we knew we were going to need executive buy-in. So things had gotten to a pretty miserable state. I don't recommend that you intentionally put things there, unless you are also working on your resume in parallel. But I think we have all lived in that kind of environment where we know that a lot of things are wrong, and being able to articulate those specifics to the business and paint the picture for them of, what if, this CEO, that's in charge of, 10% of our ARR wasn't calling our CEO every week and demanding to know what we were doing about this problem. That'd be a pretty ideal change. So being able to paint it for them in business value terms was key to getting executive buy-in. We did target low-hanging fruit. These were services that not only were valuable, but were also decoupled from some of the risky change associated with our main monolithic app. We did a shotgun approach. We embedded SRE, in several places. We made a bunch of different changes all at once across them so that we could compare and contrast what was going to be successful and what wasn't, and kind of get learnings rather than trying serially one at a time. Oh, that didn't work. Let's iterate. That didn't work. We knew that because the human factor was involved, that the human-to-human interactions were something that we would have to kind of try a lot in order to master how we could most effectively build up trust. And we overstaffed at first, so we knew also that if we wanted to get our SRE individual contributors out of a firefighting mode, we had to give them the breathing room to do that. And so if they just immediately went from one giant kitchen sink to a small kitchen sink, that was not going to help them at all. We very deliberately put them in situations where they were in a 1-to-1 or a 4-to-1 dev to SRE ratio, so they could spend some amount of time maintaining the services that their devs were building and responsible for, and also a large amount of time just remembering how to be SRE again and focusing on that automation and kind of the fundamentals.
Can I interject something here?
Please.
It's definitely also a little bit about not just remembering how to be SRE if you've done it before, but also it simplified learning how to be an SRE if you hadn't been one before. So we actually, in our squad, took on a person who had been a CS manager and are in the process of ramping him up as an SRE. And with this much more limited scope of responsibility, we found that we were able to get him making meaningful changes to production code within a couple of weeks because he wasn't worried about breaking everything with one mistake. So he was a little bit more relaxed about doing the work, and he understood that the scope of his changes were much more confined, and that gave him the confidence to sort of move a little bit more quickly and not worry quite as much.
That's true, and the headcount over provisioning also paid off there, because if an SRE took a risk and broke a thing, other SRE had bandwidth to jump in and fix it. And instead of being angry and frustrated and sad because their stress level went from 110% bearable to 150% of what was bearable, it went from oh, this is pretty okay, and I was going to work on this other thing that was kind of optional, but instead I'm going to help you get unstuck. And it allowed them also to really take risks and know that the team had time and bandwidth to support them instead of them just being out on a limb on their own.
Absolutely. So there are definitely a lot of things we learned. Not all of it was super positive. Obviously, there were always bumps in the road, but many of the objectives that we set out to achieve were achieved, and this is sort of I think the top list of things that we really found worked well by sort of really buying into this process and really integrating and embedding in the squads. Getting a group of people together who are not accustomed to working together isn't just about technical integration, right? There's other barriers to getting that to work, including the way people communicate, what they think their priorities are versus what the actual priorities are. And the more you meet and discuss and learn each other's language, not just technically, but also kind of interpersonally, the better it seemed to work. It seemed to be that we were beginning to develop real velocity because we had legitimate give and take, and they would be willing to put aside a feature for us if we felt that there was a stability concern. And likewise, we would help them push a feature if that was something that had been a previous commitment that was a high priority. So we developed a sense of real trust and kind of team consistency, and we always are able to go back to sort of seeing that, again, this wasn't about some technical wizardry. It was much more about sort of just getting aligned.
And one other thing that we really did on the good practices side was it wasn't that everything was miserable and bad everywhere. I mean, we did have stuff that we knew worked and was working well, even in the old model. And so we made sure to scale and reinforce those out with the rest of the squads. We had a pretty good PR process and code review and so on. And we had also a pretty good blameless incident handling process and culture. And we really tried to reinforce that so that we wouldn't lose the things that we knew were good as we iterated to try to make the things that were bad better. We did hit some stumbling blocks. The perception I think that a lot of folks have working with kind of traditional operators is that they're the sort of mean guys in the basement that will tell you no and yell at you for being dumb for even asking, and you have to kind of be a supplicant and try to get what you want and get out of there as singed as possible.
Baked goods help, for sure.
And that's a mindset that's pretty hard to change. And when you're in that mindset, it's a very adversarial type of relationship that you develop. And so in one of the squads that didn't perform as well when we pivoted to an embedded SRE model, we went from being mean people in the basement to nice people in the basement that they would just come to all the time, demanding a lot of things from, but still wanted to keep us in the basement, And,
I'm laughing partly not because that's so funny, but because I hadn't seen this slide yet, because Jonathan is modifying the deck behind my back, apparently. But yeah,
I trust you, Jen.
It's fabulous. It's so good. But it's really true. I mean, I think that, I think everybody can identify with the idea that you kind of have to catch the person you're making this request from on the right day, under the right circumstances, just after lunch, just sort of right after they've had their coffee, caffeine is really kicking in. And again, that's one of these things that we're really trying to combat, right? We don't want to be seen as people who are just filling your requests because you're asking, but partnering with you on making these things really valuable to the business. So again, I think what's funny about this is that, I had this idea that, you kind of think of an SRE, the kind of current version of it is this overworked, thermometer in mouth, unapproachable sort of sick bird, right? And really what we want SRE to be is this, right? Really approachable, definitely somebody you want to have a beer with, definitely somebody that you want to collaborate with and work with, right? So I think that for us was really the thing that shifted the most, was going from being simply the sick bird or the not so nice guys in the basement to being somebody I think organizationally is viewed as valuable collaborators.
Yeah, another way to think about it is I think that our organization had gotten accustomed to a model where, SRE really was SRE in name only, and essentially we were kind of cafeteria workers doling out infra, slapping it onto your tray as you walk by, SRE bucket, next. And nobody wants to hang out with that person, and nobody wants to go to the cafeteria, to that environment and have that interaction. And what we want to be more of is the executive chef at a nice restaurant that's coming out and talking to the customers, and they're excited to meet them because they're kind of a celebrity, and and giving feedback on the dishes and iterating in real time and finding out what's working and isn't working. And it's a great and engaging, exciting environment for everyone.
If you're gluten-free, we can handle it.
Exactly. And so that is something that we have achieved in large part with Jed's squad, and we hope to continue to achieve and iterate on and expand out to the rest of the organization.
100% agree. Obviously, we wanted to make sure there was time for questions. If there's not questions now, we'd be happy to talk with anybody about the things that we did that have worked really well, and also we're happy to talk about the things that just absolutely crashed and burned, because obviously we have plenty of those stories too.
With the embedded SRE model, what do you do after a project is quote-unquote done?
That's a really good question. So there's a couple of different modes that we're sort of exploring now. One of them is sort of maintenance mode, where we engage and spend, call it a few months of really, really kind of dedicated and very focused effort, at which point, depending on where we get the kind of service to in terms of stability and reliability and observability, we may actually back off into a maintenance mode. With the bigger projects and the sort of more key features, we intend to just keep going and sort of say, okay, we're going to plan our next quarter, and this is something that we're in the process of doing now. It's like plan our next quarter with these squads we've embedded in and set ourselves new goals and set, kind of reflect, in the model of sort of decide, figuring out what we did that worked, we will just move forward and make a new set of plans. So it's a little bit dependent on the sort of the service itself. Do you want to?
I think that, in the optimum, outcome, we basically end up in that circumstance where like the devs and the SRE together come up with so many great ideas about what this new model can unlock, and they're just constantly iterating and moving up the stack into better and better like outcomes. And also, we have encountered an operating mode where, again, we're just like the nice basement people, and that actually like was a risk that we anticipated, but the challenge there has actually been disengaging into maintenance mode, because now that they have their claws sunk into this group of dedicated basement folks, they don't want to let go. And there's also some like organizational face saving at the executive level of like, well, if I'm the one that admits that like my team wasted and squandered this resource or this engagement, then I look bad. So it must be something else that made this engagement not successful. And so there's been some resistance to pulling back, but we had a very strong alignment with our leadership up the chain. And very strong buy-in from the CTO. I actually met with our CTO one-on-one ahead of time and let him know that I anticipated that might happen, so that he would be ready to kind of step in if needed to arbitrate and say, no, okay, it's not that you're bad, it's not that SRE is bad, maybe we're just not ready for that engagement in this context yet. So I think one of the things that you need to do is craft those exit strategies in advance and say, okay, if it goes perfectly, we're going to end up in this like kind of kumbaya world that we all want to be in. If it goes miserably, then how do we get out? And also, like, what are some interstitial failure modes that are still like valuable? And so in one of our cases, we're in that process right now of taking a service out of SRE, but making sure that it's maintainable and stable, so that we hopefully don't have to get roped into it again in a year or two.
In the distribution of having SRE kind of orthogonal to all of the squads, I mean, one of the basic concepts of squad model is that everyone does everything. It's more of a DevOps agile, kind of implementation. So have you ever considered, or do you do as a matter of practice, training everyone in SRE or uplifting them so that they start to take on that responsibility themselves inside of the squad?
Yeah, so that is an excellent question, and that is something that we have kind of been doing in parallel. So we've been identifying opportunities with squads that are already kind of ahead of the curve in terms of how they think about infrastructure, and making sure that we're not gatekeepers, that they have like full access to do everything they want to do, and it's just kind of a trust-based approach with some verification at the end. We have some tooling running to check for like really bad failure modes, like 0.0.0.0/0 as a NACL, security policy that we find way more often than we should. So it unblocked the communication to our, to SQL. I don't know why you guys are so upset. What do you mean the network traffic outbound is spiking to Romania? So that is something we want to enable. We want to enable devs that want to do that. I think it's also potentially you run the risk of a failure mode where if you have lots of people doing that in a very broad organization, they're going to do that in so many different ways, and you're going to miss opportunities to identify economies of scale. I don't believe in centrally saying, here is the solution to do all of the things and you must subscribe to it, because I think that's just the basement ops writ large. But I do subscribe to, hey, let's do this in a way that we can demonstrate it's repeatable and adds value, and make sure that that's accessible to everybody and that we like normalize that. And to some extent, that comes from having that broad perspective of all the problems all the squads are seeing that you don't necessarily get at that line level. And so you might end up with folks iterating in a way that's sort of like counterproductive because of emergent behaviors at the broader scale that they can't see. So the question is, why not build in resiliency where SRE is the squad that you're in forever?
I was gonna tack this on to what Jonathan was saying, because I think that part of the answer to your question that we're doing is we also rotate through SRE, like nomads through SRE. So SRE from other embedded squads are rotating through like 2 weeks or 3 weeks at a time in my squad, and they actually then usually take on a project that's not like critical path mission critical, but they take on a project and they work on that stuff. And the idea would be that, let's say that you're really, really interested in Elasticsearch or some kind of data, you have the ability to be exposed to that in a kind of nomad type model. And then if you really like it, then stay, right? And does that help? Like we're trying to really sort of make sure that we still have the ability to say 3 people are out, 2 other people can step in, and build in a little bit of that redundancy, but there is some level of specialization that I think is unavoidable in this case. I mean, at least at the stage we are, because there was so much to learn before that it wasn't really possible for any one person to be really, really good at any of it. Go ahead.
One last note I would add is for like specific questions or thoughts or ideas about strategies that may or may not work. One thing to consider too is like these are things that worked for us, but I think more broadly what really worked for us was like trying it a lot of different ways at once and coming up with a hypothesis and a time limit and an exit strategy and experimenting and seeing. Like we're fumbling around in the like super dark and we're in like a slightly brighter twilight state probably in most respects. Yeah, that's why biology is awesome. So we're just trying to like fumble our way closer and closer to the light. And I encourage a mode where you discover the failure states that your organization has and the landmines that are out there and whatnot, and be ready to iterate quickly and in a lot with a broad surface area instead of serially, which was something we had actually been trying for a while.
Great talk. Thanks for sharing. I just had a general question about the size of your SRE organization, if you can speak on it, what it is now and what it was when you realized you needed to make these substantial changes.
Yeah, so now we have about 20, and we have about 500 engineers, and 20 meaning like 20 people total in infrastructure operations, SRE, people that care about servers and stuff, and about 500 non-SRE devs and folks on that side of engineering. When we realized things were like really going sideways, it was probably half that on both fronts, about 10 to 250.
So I'll squeeze in two quick ones. Number one, on the embedded SRE, did you have developers on call as first responders? Did you consider that? And number two, you talked about overstaffing at first, but obviously in the beginning you said you didn't have enough SREs, right? So how did you tactically achieve that overstaffing in the early days?
Yeah, so it was very quickly, to respect everyone's time here, the devs were on call, and every incident had devolved into dev is on call, dev gets paged, the dev looks at the incident channel for 30 seconds, dev pages SRE, dev says this is out of my hands, dev goes to sleep, right? So like it wasn't the case that was not in place, it was just that like, as much as we had those practices and people, like, I think part of that comes from like the tragedy of the commons and like kind of social behaviors that you get to when you go past a certain size. Like if you've never met the person you're about to page, it's like way easier to page them and go to sleep than if you like see them every day, and they're gonna be like, what the hell, when they get in the next morning, right? That was, I think, areas where our organization and processes weren't scaling with, with the behaviors that naturally emerge when you grow. I'm sorry, I forgot the second half of your question. Oh, the overstaffing. Yeah, so that was a deliberate risk we took, and we were very upfront with management that like, hey, by the way, we're also shrinking the kitchen sink, so like that's just like it's miserable now, but it's going to be more miserable later. But what we're basically saying is we're like surfing close enough to the asymptote that like you're going to be, the internal user happiness, if you will, like our engineers' happiness is not meaningfully going to be affected by the fact that it takes them like 3 months to get some random thing they want instead of like 2 months. But that was an area where there was a lot of pain, and we had to get and continue to get some pushback because we basically like stripped the core operations, squad down to its bare bones so that we could afford that overstaffing. It was kind of a gamble, right? And so the takeaway at the end is when the CEO goes to like one of your development directors and is like, whatever you're doing, keep doing it, then, that's the payoff. But it was a risk. I mean, I'm not going to say I didn't update my resume.
So, yeah, anyway, so we're hiring, but are you? No, just kidding. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.